This is the story of ChrysCapital. But to understand how it became India's largest homegrown private equity firm, you have to start long before the first deal, with two young men, a Wall Street apprenticeship, and a bet that a country most global investors were ignoring was about to open up. It's a story that begins not with money, but with conviction. Let's go back to the beginning. At the center of this story are two people, Ashish, Dhawan, and Raj Kondur. They met as classmates at Harvard Business School in the mid-1990s, two ambitious Indians building careers in American finance. Neither came from private equity royalty. What they shared was a first-class training on Wall Street, a restlessness, and a growing belief that the real opportunity of their generation wasn't in New York at all. It was back home, in an India that was just beginning to open its economy to the world. To understand the firm they built, you first have to understand where each of them came from. Ashish Dhawan grew up in Kolkata and went to Yale, graduating magna cum laude in applied mathematics and economics, before earning his MBA at Harvard. His apprenticeship was a tour of the sharpest corners of American finance. He started at the boutique investment bank Wasserstein Perella, where he was the only Indian analyst. He then joined McCown De Leeuw, an 8-person private equity firm in California, as the junior-most associate. Remember that name, McCown De Leeuw, because it comes back later. After his MBA, he landed at Goldman Sachs, in its risk arbitrage group. He was, by any measure, on a golden path. And then, at just 29, he decided to give it up and move back to India, a country he had barely worked in as an adult. Raj Kondur took a parallel route. A Harvard batchmate of Dhawan's, he built his career as a management consultant at A.T. Kearney and then at Morgan Stanley in the United States. At Morgan Stanley, he wasn't a bystander. He sat on a 7-member team responsible for investing the $1 billion Prince's Gate Fund and worked in the mergers and acquisitions department focused on private equity. So while Dhawan learned the craft of investing at small, hungry firms, Kondur learned it inside one of the biggest names on the street, moving real institutional money. Two different vantage points on the same idea, that buying stakes in private companies and patiently building their value was one of the most powerful engines in finance. In late 1998, Raj Kondur walked away from his Morgan Stanley job, and together the two friends made their move. Their thesis was simple but, at the time, almost contrarian. India had just spent years liberalizing its economy. A generation of entrepreneurs was building real companies that needed capital and expertise to scale, and there was almost no organized private equity to serve them. Global investors saw risk and red tape. Dhawan and Kondur saw a wide-open field. They set up shop in Mumbai and named their venture ChrysCapital, later shortened to ChrysCapital, a chrysalis being the casing from which something transforms and takes flight. Now they just needed someone to fund the dream. This was the hardest part. Two men in their early 30s, with no fund track record of their own, trying to raise money for private equity in a country most institutions viewed as unproven. Their first break came from a familiar name, a $500,000 seed investment from American private equity veterans, including George McCown, of McCown De Leeuw, the very firm where Dhawan had once been the junior-most associate. Armed with that vote of confidence, the pair spent roughly 5 months crisscrossing the United States, flying the cheapest airlines and living out of inexpensive hotels, pitching dozens of skeptical investors. Many said no, but the sheer energy and clarity of the two founders slowly began to win people over. By the fall of 1999, the persistence paid off. ChrysCapital closed its first fund with roughly $63.8 million committed. It doesn't sound enormous today, but at the time it made ChrysCapital one of the earliest independent private equity franchises in the country. They had built something that barely existed in India before, and then timing took over. The firm launched straight into the global dotcom boom, and like almost everyone else in those heady years, it leaned into internet and technology companies, including an early bet on the outsourcing pioneer Spectrumite. For a while, it looked like they had timed it perfectly. They hadn't. When the dot-com bubble burst in 2000 and 2001, ChrysCapital's technology-heavy portfolio took a hard hit, and the young firm faced its first real crisis. In 2002, co-founder Raj Kondur left. Publicly, it was cast as taking responsibility for the losses, but the fuller story is that he and Dhawan had fallen out, and Kondur was eased out of the partnership. He went on to found a business process outsourcing company called Nirvana Business Solutions, and years later returned to investing, backing companies like the online grocer Big Basket. From this point on, ChrysCapital would be Ashish Dhawan's firm to rebuild. What Dhawan did next defined the firm. Rather than let the crash define ChrysCapital, he reinvented it, shifting from chasing hype to a disciplined, research-driven style that blended private equity with smart positions in public markets. He focused on sectors riding India's structural growth and became a pioneer in financial services, taking early stakes in names like Axis Bank, Yes Bank, Shriram Transport Finance, Mahindra Finance, and later AU Small Finance Bank. The lesson of the dotcom years had been absorbed. The biggest returns in India would come not from fads, but from deep conviction held patiently over many years. Nowhere did that patience pay off more than in pharmaceuticals. ChrysCapital built genuine expertise in healthcare, and its most famous bet was Mankind Pharma. When it first invested in 2007, Mankind was best known for a consumer condom brand. By the time ChrysCapital exited in 2015, it had become a full-fledged pharmaceutical powerhouse and one of the firm's signature wins. Add Intas Pharmaceuticals and Eris Life Sciences, and healthcare became a pillar of the firm's returns. Go deep, stay patient, let a great business compound. That was now the ChrysCapital way. Then, in 2012, Ashish Dhawan did something rare. At the height of his success, he walked away from private equity to devote himself to improving Indian education, founding the Central Square Foundation and becoming a driving force behind Ashoka University. It raised an obvious danger. Could a founder-led firm survive losing its founder? For most, the answer is no. ChrysCapital is the exception. Kunal Shroff, who had been with the firm since its very first year, stepped up as managing partner, supported by seasoned partners including Sanjeev Kaul, Sanjay Kukreja, and Ashley Meneses. The handover was gradual, deliberate, and smooth, and the firm only grew stronger. Today, ChrysCapital has raised close to $8.5 billion across 10 funds. In November 2025, it closed its 10th fund at a record $2.2 billion, which it calls the largest ever raised by an India-focused private equity firm. Over its life, it has returned nearly $7.8 billion to investors, at roughly 3 times their money. From 2 classmates on cheap flights and a $63 million first fund, it became the giant of Indian private equity. The lesson of their story is simple. The beginning matters, but what you build to outlast yourself matters more. Thanks for listening.